Good
So,
spot.
yeah.
Hello, welcome to the Digital Writers Festival Microfiction Clinic. I'm Julian Novitz. I'm a lecturer at Swinburne University of Technology and Writing, and I would just like to start by acknowledging that I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nation and would like to acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. And I'm joined today by Jack Stanton from Sydney.
Hi, so I'm Jack. I'm the flash fiction editor for Seizure Online, which is a digital publication based in Sydney. And I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land, which for me is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and it is upon their ancestral lands that we are. And I pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country.
Right. So Jack, today we're talking about microfiction, which can be broadly defined as stories or any works of prose narratives under 1,000 words or under 500 words or under 300 words, and increasingly, even if I suppose we include the tradition of the 6-word story in that as well, they can be a quite radically concise form.
Mm-hmm.
So as you're obviously, you're a writer of microfiction and the flash fiction editor for Seizure, how would you define some of the unique qualities or distinguishing features of microfiction as a particular form of storytelling?
I would say probably the most important thing is picking a single idea, a single moment, and almost putting it under a microscope. So having the actual size, the actual form also reflect the content, what it's actually focusing on. And so I usually find that the best flash fiction is the most focused.
Right. Yeah. So, and what would you say is often the actual focus of a piece of flash fiction? I mean, does it come down to one particular moment in a narrative that has some kind of a symbolic resonance? What else might be going on in the lives of the characters, or can it be a bit broader than that?
Right. That's a good question. I mean, there are a lot of flash fiction stories that can say a lot in a short amount of words. A lot of things can happen, and that's because it becomes incredibly dependent on summary. And in order to tell this story, which is unusual because that style of storytelling in bigger pieces can often be discouraged. So in like a standard short fiction workshop that you teach, you're always encouraging students to dramatize, never to keep summary to an absolute minimum, never kind of condense time, but focus on detail, focus on the drama of interaction. And in microfiction, you're often breaking some of those rules that you're taught or you really internalize as a writer of conventional short fiction or longer form pieces. You have to think about how you can make summary itself dramatic and interesting for the reader. Yeah, look, I actually have maybe an unpopular opinion, which is I'm not too bothered by a lot of summary. In fact, one of my favorite books, and this is just a brief digression, is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which has been criticized because it is so dense in its summary, but that's also simultaneously why it's so rich.
Yeah.
So I think summary really does have a function, but that being said as well, there's a large amount of flash fiction that is much more the cousin of poetry, or even prose poem, for example. I would say that certain flash fiction would appear, from a formal point of view, very similar to prose poetry. So I think there is a real spectrum of approaches that you can take with it.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. And I mean, as the editor of flash fiction at Seizure magazine, I mean, Seizure tends to define flash fiction as pieces that are under 500 words, correct? Yeah. So, is there kind of a radical difference between different pieces of flash fiction or short or microfiction between a piece that's, say, under 500 words or a piece that's under, say, 1,000 words, or even on the shorter end? Like, you know, is it just a matter of getting it more and more concise and more focused, or you know, some real aesthetic differences between that come out of that particular length?
Yes. My cynical nature means that I always try to explain things in relation to when it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, one of the main things I notice as a kind of trend is, like you said, 500 words is what we consider microfiction. Anything beneath that. And one of the most common things we find in our submission portal is 499 words. And so what's happened there is a story that is usually longer that ends up being compressed in order to accommodate the word count.
Yeah.
Sometimes the actual narrative approach there is it's not coming from the right origins, because they've envisioned it as a longer piece and then curtailed and made it more concise. But then the result is that the story itself actually feels clipped.
Yeah.
And that's because quite often what the writer has done is clipped and compromised certain aspects of the story to make it fit a word count. So to answer your question, my favorite microfictions, just in general, and of course there are exceptions, will be around the 250 to 300 word down. I really think it's a less is more sort of environment.
Really embrace the possibilities of the form itself and come up with a story that just fits that particular bracket. That's interesting. Yeah. So that kind of actually brings me to my next question, which is thinking, I suppose, about the distinct aesthetic or the experience that we get from a good or successful piece of microfiction. So I've read some definitions of microfiction online, which basically just say it's a radically condensed story. It's kind of a story that's stripped of all extraneous detail, that just gets down to the absolute nub of what this narrative is about, the most essential points. And I suppose that's one possible, pretty sensible way of defining microfiction. But it does just feel like that it does the form a bit of an injustice if we think about it as just like a radically pared back short story or a radically pared back longer narrative. In the same way, I think, like, you know, some of the discussion about the novella tends to emphasize that it's a radically, you know, streamlined novel rather than it as a form of its own possibilities. So I'm wondering, like, just essentially to get, sorry, it's a bit of a rambly question, but what you feel like a good piece of microfiction does that, say, you know, conventional short story can't do? What kind of experience should it offer for the reader?
That's a good question. I would say that it's not necessarily a different end goal to a novel, but it's achieved in a different way. So I think all good novels or good stories, narratives, don't neatly tie themselves off at the end.
Yeah.
And I think the measure of whether a book was really kind of meaningful to you is how long you think about it afterwards. And there are some flash fictions that I've read which almost borderline on kind of riddly and cryptic in its origins, and its actual intent is to enhance how much its afterglow, like how much it resonates after reading. For example, there's this one story called "The Outing" by Lydia Davis, right? In which there is actually not a main character, and the story initially appears to be just a kind of observation of images, and the whole flash fiction is one sentence, which is fewer than 100 words. And actually, I've got it up here, so if I could, I'd like to read it. So it's called The Outing by Lydia Davis. An outburst of anger near the road, a refusal to speak on the path, a silence in the pine woods, a silence across the old railroad bridge, an attempt to be friendly in the water, a refusal to end the argument on the flat stones, a cry of anger on the steep bank of dirt, a weeping among the bushes. So that's the entire story. And of course, what she's done is she's proven, firstly, that microfiction has its own set of rules, because a lot of the narrative rules that traditionally govern stories are broken here. There's no protagonist. There's no identifiable main character. At least not in the text itself. The character is actually found in the subtext between the lines, between each passage.
Yeah.
And the sentence has been divided in a way that each comma after the image is actually indicating the passage of time. So she's using punctuation to denote time, as opposed to the text itself. And then the third thing, of course, is that these are all just observations of the actions themselves are just little stills, little flashes. So this, obviously, as you can tell, I have strong opinions about this story, but it's because it's one that I read and never forgot, because it was so striking in its construction and its kind of resonant riddle, I suppose.
Yeah. And I suppose, I mean, like, particularly with a piece of microfiction that's short, that's about 100 words or so. I mean, you almost internalize the whole piece. You know it word by word if you come back to it and you think it through as well. So, and that's something actually you can fully take away the full narrative with you in a way that you can't always with a longer story or a longer narrative. Yeah, I mean, that piece just reminded me, I just looked it up here quickly, of another piece of microfiction that I really adore, which is House by Josephine Rowe, from her collection of stories. Which again, I mean, much like the Lydia Davis piece, is a story that appears to be without characters, without like a central people as its focus. It's just describing a location. And if I can just throw that up on the screen, actually. That now, when I write of the house, it's only ever the one house. Its smell of smoke and old wood, boxed books, dry blue gum, ripped lazily from the overgrown yard. And it just describes the space and leaves you enough kind of clues and hints in this very short piece of writing to imagine the characters who have lived there and the whatever particular narrative is played out within that location, that space. So I agree that's something you can't really do, or you couldn't possibly really get away with in a conventional short story or longer form narrative. So yeah. So and also, I suppose, I mean, like, one of the appeals of microfiction for me is perhaps coming from someone who's like, more of comes from a more traditional short fiction focus, is this incredible focus it can bring to like one particular incident or exchange between characters, and to scrutinize it in a really strong level of detail, and just capture one particular emotional moment you might get in a trajectory exchange between characters, which could probably serve as a turning point or the crux of a whole story. But when it gets that kind of that focus and scrutiny of microfiction, it can really make you think through that particular emotional state. I mean, like one particular example that I thought I might just throw up here again and screen share that I think does that quite successfully. Oh, sorry, that's entirely the wrong. Was These Two Cousins by Dave Eggers, which just captures this moment. I'm not like a massive fan of Dave Eggers generally, but some of his microfiction has really stayed with me, and it just captures one particular moment of awkwardness or unease between two people, where the sense of strangeness or alienation isn't even really rational, but the character sort of feels it intensely anyway. And it's not quite enough. You can stretch like a 2,000 or 3,000 word story out of this, but to give it that kind of that focus and detail in one particular story just feels quite powerful to me in that respect.
Yeah, you know, while you've been talking about the Dave Eggers piece, I think maybe a really good example of a story that gets close. It's not quite microfiction, but is still achieving the same things in a slightly longer form. Would be the Ernest Hemingway story, "Hills Like White Elephants."
Yes. Yeah.
I think that really perfectly summarizes what microfiction sets out to accomplish.
Yeah, it's about what, sort of 1,000 words or so, isn't it? It's a very short piece, and yeah, it just I suppose the whole ambiguity of the interaction between the characters in that story, how much is conveyed through seemingly quite banal dialogue, but the kind of the depths and layers you have to unpackage yeah. So one thing that I did want to ask you as we're running on to the panel is coming back to perhaps your own practice and craft as a writer of microfiction. How does a piece of microfiction begin for you, or a microfiction story begin for you? Is it usually a longer narrative that you start peering back, you start focusing in on, or does it come up with one particular idea, one particular image that you want to explore and expand in a particular way?
Yeah, so I'm a bit of a neurotic rewriter, so I stop and start stories a lot. I start at one point and it doesn't feel right, and so essentially what I do is I imagine the sort of bigger story, and then I look at the kind of timeline of what I can imagine in that story, and I experiment at which point to tell it. So, for example, one story I'm working on now is about 250 words. It's just one paragraph, and it's about an incident that happened that actually really happened, which is that my mother's father passed away quite a few years ago on Good Friday, and my mother's side of the family is Lebanese, and so Good Friday and Christian Lebanese, so it's a really big kind of celebration. And what we had done is we went and we had this Good Friday celebration at my relative's house, and in order to get there, they live in Punchbowl, and in order to get there, we drive past the cemetery where my mother's father is buried. And I remember coming home and we were eating the leftovers kind of just from the big barbecue, and my mother started crying, and she was upset, of course, because what had happened is we'd driven right past the cemetery and none of us had thought to stop. And so I really played a long time with this story where to begin it, but I knew that it always needed to be really, really short and to convey one kind of feeling that evoked a bigger kind of picture. So I decided to start the story eventually at the dinner table, and it's just one scene at the dinner table and how each person in the family kind of reacts at the table at that moment. So I guess the answer to your question is to inflate and then compress and just find the incision in time that's going to, and then you don't need the rest because your reader's smart. They'll get it.
Yeah.
You know.
So at what point in the writing process do you start to realize and figure out what pieces need to be cut away, and what are the kinds of details or character moments or interactions that you ultimately feel as kind of disposable there?
That's a good question. I think the kind of riddly or semi-abstract precedent of the form gives you a lot of freedom to play with removing things, because people approach flash fiction with the understanding that they're going to have to do some more interpretive work. So one of the best things, and I brought up the Hemingway story intentionally, is using dialogue to speak indirectly about things. So I strongly believe that all good writing is two things happening at once. There's the surface level, but then something happening underneath. And the trick is being able to accomplish that. And that's I think, the power of editing. You're not going to know what that second deeper story is really going to be until you write everything out first and then review and think.
Yeah.
And I think you should be able to say, well, this happens on the surface, but it's really about this. And this gets lumped into generic sort of terms like themes and concepts and ideas and emotions. But when you think of it like that, it becomes more of a kind of concrete element in the story. Like if it exists in your mind, it will exist in the story, you know.
Great. Yeah. And so, I mean, we've talked a bit about in your experience as a editor of microfiction and the flash fiction editor for Seizure.
Mm-hmm.
That often one of the areas where microfiction writers go wrong is the 499 word story where they've just paired a longer piece back to
Mm-hmm.
get under that word count without really embracing what microfiction is really about. I'm just wondering if there's another area where writers might potentially go wrong, which is where perhaps a piece of microfiction just feels like an isolated scene from a longer narrative, or something that's truncated and not necessarily satisfying in and of itself. So I was just wondering if you could give your thoughts or your opinion on what it takes for a piece of microfiction to feel complete for the reader as something, as a story that sort of stands on its own.
Yeah. It's a funny paradox, really, because on one hand, you don't want everything to be crystalline and tied up and all finished. But at the same time, you need a sense that it has completed itself. I think the point you made earlier about its emphasis on singularity would be the obvious, which is that quite often a piece that is meant to be longer will have other threads through it which don't make sense in the self-contained piece. There might be a character who pops in and has some kind of functional role and it alludes to some future importance, but they never appear again, for example. Or they refer to a level of backstory that hasn't been properly explained within the text in front of you, but might be perfectly acceptable in a short story. I suppose my next unpopular opinion would be that I'm a real believer that it's about the voice and not the plot. And I think that that's the real difference, and it becomes really clear to me that when someone is focusing on the voice of their flash fiction story more than it having to go anywhere necessarily, then I really connect with that kind of a little bit more. And I think that the tendency to try and plot flash fiction is going to inherently push you to write more words.
Yeah.
Because it has this kind of step by step. It doesn't need to be chronological, but it is built upon a step by step approach. But microfiction is trying to just be one step really on a pedestal.
That's a great way of putting it, and it's a way, I suppose, of focusing on what microfiction can deliver about, I suppose, voice or a particular kind of emotional felt sense of a situation, or just like honing in on that and what that character feels at that particular moment, and making that the entire story. Because I read like a few years ago some particularly bad, I suppose, advice about what microfiction is, which was essentially, it's this condensed story, and you have to have a twist or a turning point in the narrative and wrap things up in a way that's unexpected for the reader, all in 500 words. And I suppose, there are pieces that work that way, but it feels a bit reductive for what microfiction can be as its own formal storytelling medium. And so I think this idea of focusing on the voice and bringing the voice out first and foremost is a great way of understanding it.
Yeah.
So maybe just getting kind of back into kind of like, technical elements of microfiction and perhaps even your own writing process. I mean, we talk a lot in writing about, more conventional longer form fiction of short stories, or even like a novel, of the importance of the opening, of the hook, of the idea of like the perfect first sentence or perfect first image that captures the reader's attention. I mean, is there that same kind of demand in microfiction, or does it operate in a different way when you're composing, you know, quite a radically short piece of writing or a narrative?
I think it does function in similar ways. And my main argument for that would be, what is a novel anyway except a succession of microfictions, you know? So I think, for example, Seizure, one of the driving forces behind Flashes, its purpose, it's targeted primarily, or at least implicitly, toward emerging writers, and that's not a reference to their age, but rather their experience. Anybody who's looking for a kind of playground to experiment with the construction of story. So I think underlying it, yes, it does. I think all good storytelling needs tension, and I attended this lecture which the Irish novelist Claire Keegan gave, and she explained tension and conflict, right? Because once again, these are these kind of terms where everybody uses them and presumes that the other person knows what they're talking about. But for a long time, I actually haven't been able to clearly articulate what tension and conflict comprises. And I think, and I'm paraphrasing here, what Claire Keegan said is that tension and conflict is the result of loss. And it's only once a character enters into this space of loss and they're unable to go back, you know, and so usually the character comes out of that with a sense of kind of learning or further loss or something. But I think what happens is a flash fiction story will generally drop you in the center of that moment. So it does really. I think you need to think more broadly about the microfiction story than what's on the page, and this comes down to the kind of resonance afterwards. How can it have any kind of resonance afterwards if it hasn't had to resolve some kind of, or at least address some kind of tension or conflict? Would be how I feel.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. Is, I mean, the pieces of microfiction that stay with me the longest often are these ones that, as you put it, express this kind of this sense of loss. They don't even get into what the meaning or the significance of that loss is, but the sense that something has been taken from the character in kind of a major or minor way, or even a way that they can't quite understand, and they're sort of grappling with the need to comprehend that. And I mean, it's I suppose what's great about microfiction is that you don't need to explain or explore, you know, what the consequence of this would be. You can leave that to the reader, but you can just focus on that kind of that felt emotional sense of that particular moment, and get them to sort of get the reader to think through that emotional state. Yeah. So one other thing that I wanted to talk a bit about in the time we have remaining is I suppose the rise of digital literature and digital writing and its connection to microfiction. So of course, Seizure is a completely online journal which allows you the space to publish and promote works like microfiction that wouldn't necessarily be viable in a print-only culture. There was, you know, microfiction is often, I suppose, overlooked or neglected because there isn't like often an easy way of transmitting it through print. But now in a digital age, you know, you can publish and promote individual microfiction stories very effectively. So have you seen a connection or any sort of links between sort of the types of flash fiction that you're publishing in Seizure to other emergent forms of digital storytelling online, like Twitter or social media? I mean, are these kind of movements in storytelling that draw off the same kind of pool of skills or expertise?
Yeah, I used to, maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, for about a year before I started working for Seizure, I used to post flash fictions that I'd written, and I wouldn't edit them really that much, but I would just post them on social media, and like on my Facebook page, just as a post, and you know, most of the people who read them were sort of my close friends who had to tell me that they liked them anyway. But you know, it is conducive to. I definitely wouldn't say that it's a product of digital culture, but it fits very neatly. And part of that is, look, there's this whole kind of defeatist conversation going around about people's attention spans, right, and how they're being affected. And so I think it's really easy to say, oh, well, you know, of course, microfiction is conducive to, you know, the internet and the associated attention problems. But I don't actually know if that's really true, because I think that if something's important to you and if something's meaningful, you'll always invest the time into it.
Yeah.
So, you know, and some flash fiction stories, like I know we're talking about the David Foster Wallace radically condensed history of post-industrial life, right? Which is from Brief Interviews with Hideous Men. And I'm going to share that now. Right. Yeah, horrible font on this one here, but I'll read this one again because it's short. You're seeing the pattern that a lot of the fiction I like is really short. When they were introduced, he made a witticism, hoping to be liked. She laughed very hard, hoping to be liked. Then each drove home alone, staring straight ahead, with the very same twist to their faces. The man who'd introduced them didn't much like either of them, though he acted as if he did, anxious as he was to preserve good relations at all times. One never knew, after all. Now did one, now did one, now did one. And so I absolutely love this story, and I think I love it largely because it's a summary, but it's a kind of sketch, and the people themselves are intentionally vague, and by being vague, he's showing it almost as like a little thought piece, and he's kind of asking you to imagine yourself as either of these three people. You can be any of these three people, and you probably have been this kind of person at some point. But, you know, I mean, we can go into Foster Wallace being forever obsessed with how people judged him, and like he was sort of neurotically upset about the fact that everything he did in his life he'd done to be liked or loved, and, you know, about projecting self as opposed to just being self, I think was a big but the point I'm trying to make is I return to this story. You know, I read it for the first time maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and I continue to read it, and I get people to read it. You know, and so the answer to your question is I'm not sure. I can't tell you, but I do. I think in general the rise of digital platforms is undeniably a very good thing for publications in general. You know.
Yeah. I mean, just as a sidebar, I mean, from the David Foster Wallace piece that you just read out there, I think the thing that I absolutely love in the story upon reading it a couple of times is them both the little detail about them both driving home exactly the same twist on their faces. And there's the wonderful ambiguity of the word twist there. We don't know whether it's really positive or negative or something kind of deeply ambivalent that they're both feeling at the time. And I mean, you know, in a longer piece of fiction, in a story of like a conventional magazine length story of like 2,000 or 3,000 words, or in a novel, you know, you just glide by that. You wouldn't even think about that word and why that word was particularly used there at that moment. But in a piece of this length, of, you know, it really makes you think about what's meant by that, what's being conveyed by that, what is the emotion that these two characters are both somehow feeling or sharing in their kind of disconnected ways at that time. And it is just, yeah, it's a wonderful how that transition makes you unpackage each line and each sentence and each
that's right. The less words on the page, the more attention they're given. Yeah. And this is a product of it, like I said earlier, flash fiction being a kind of artistic playground. You can play with uncertainty, and it can actually have a great effect, because the uncertainty, like, the intention is not to be certain. The intention is to prompt the reader to think through what they're reading. And that's not to say that you don't do that already, but with, like, microscopically, you know. And actually, that's just reminded me. I do have one more point on this, and this is just a kind of technical advice thing. And it's a lot of my advice, I just need to say, is not coming because I think of myself as a particularly fabulous flash fiction writer. I think it's a really, really hard genre, and I'm endlessly fascinated with it. And sometimes it happens, and sometimes it doesn't. You know, a lot of my advice is actually as an editor who's just read lots of submissions and dealt with the submission portal and observed trends throughout that, and thinking about what is recurring that is making me question a story or feel as though it's not working quite right. And I think a really big thing, and this is almost immediately invisible, is the fact that less striking flash fiction tends to over prioritize sensory detail and these kind of I think you mentioned that they're almost extraneous in flash fiction, and I really agree with that. And I think that too much description doesn't color a flash fiction. I think it cloaks it, because it gives emphasis to a kind of world building that's destined to fail, because the genre inherently restricts you from doing so. You know, in very superficial ways you can create it, but you know, it's tough for the reader to see your characters or your emotions very clearly if you spend the same amount of time describing the colors of the summer leaves or something.
Yeah,
And
so all the things that, you know, we train people to do in writing conventional short fiction or longer prose fiction to establish a sense of place or a sense of veracity in the world can be really counterproductive in microfiction. You have to unlearn a lot of those often quite deeply internalized lessons in order to be effective. Yeah. So one other point that I wanted to, or question that I wanted to ask, I mean, so, you know, we've really been talking about microfiction in that kind of, you know, 300 to 500 word bracket. I mean, my question is have you experimented with going shorter in a sense? Like how much can you pare back in a story or a narrative and have it still be kind of satisfying in a way?
Okay, that is a fantastic question. Let me just have a look at my bookshelf. I don't know if I do. Give me 1 second. All right. So what I have here, I've actually got the UTS Writers Anthology from this year, 2018. And one of the university students, she actually won the prize this year for a piece of flash fiction. And her name's Catherine Ma. And she wrote a story. And let me find it for you. Here we go. Thank you for reminding me, because this is actually a really fantastic example. And I'll show you just the length of it is there.
Yeah. Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, and I'm very sorry, but Qing Ming Ji, which means Tomb Sweeping Day by Catherine Ma. And the whole sentence is, the whole story is one sentence. Xiao Yu wondered whether the chrysanthemums on her father's tomb had been left by her mother or his mistress.
Yeah.
And she's just nailed it.
Yeah.
You know?
That's perfect, yeah.
It's perfect. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
And and it just tells a whole story
Yeah.
in a single moment. And so I think what Catherine had done there, it's funny. Any more, if you put any more in that and you took away from the focus of that sentence, you would glaze over all the detail. That could very easily be the opening of a 5,000 word story where you go and explain it.
Yeah.
But there's something in the power of its openness, while still having a very distinct identity, I think, that makes it very powerful.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad you shared that one. I mean, it stands as a kind of a classic example of what you would consider to be, you know, a great opening line of a novel or a short story. I mean, this is exactly the sort of thing that we teach students to aim for, to hook people with that you know, immediate sense of a story, of ambiguity, of a question you want answered next. And it's just so incredibly powerful in that piece to have that question not answered, to have all of that just now be up to the reader, and up to them to kind of like think through the implications of that particular sentence, of the idea of somebody contemplating that at their father's tomb, and even just the significance of the chrysanthemums. I mean, that's as the one kind of concrete detail in that particular piece. It's wonderful. Yeah. Yeah. So I suppose we have just a few minutes left. So other than obviously Seizure is a wonderful place to be thinking about publishing, exploring microfiction as a medium, are there any other outlets that writers should be aiming at or looking at for great pieces of microfiction to keep their eye on? Or
that's a tricky one. I tend to find that microfiction just pops its head up every now and then, and you know, it's I think in the major sort of publishing world, it can be not rare, but my advice would be to seek out the writers, short story writers you really enjoy. For example, I really like Lydia Davis and I really like George Saunders. So I found their microfiction works by seeking it out. And I think if you seek out the writers that you really and you really enjoy their work, you will find that they have actually published really short fiction. And I think the reason that you see that is because it is fundamentally useful, no matter where you are as a writer. And I really believe that. I actually think that we spent a lot of time talking about the kind of defining qualities of good microfiction, but just the process of writing it is, I think, incredibly useful. But yeah, to answer your question, I think Seizure, at least in Australia, is really the only one who does it, as in just exclusively. But you know, the Lifted Brow, Overland, Southerly, all of these major publications, Meanjin. I know that Mascara Literary Review is actually explicit about it on their submission guidelines, saying that they're seeking flash fiction. So all journals welcome it and actually encourage it. And I think a lot of literary journals don't get as many flash fiction submissions as they would like. So I would encourage everyone to submit flash fiction to the journals and just treat it like any other story. You know, the story's as long or short as it needs to be.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, so it can be a great opportunity for getting work published. Think about that work in that particular way. Yeah. So I think we're just about out of time for this particular session. We'd like to close out with just any quick final advice for writers of microfiction, people who are just trying to tackle or deal with the form that we haven't really covered in this conversation.
Don't use weird fonts and edit your freaking word, man.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, it's a great note to end on. So thanks, Jack, for joining me. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks, Julian.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for listening in. I hope you stay with following the Digital Writers Festivals. We have some great sessions coming up later on, and see you later.
See you later.